it would be nice if our psychedelic history was all fun stories about enlightened housewives and spiritual giants like Gerald Hurd and Walter Pankey and things like that. But as we know, sometimes we get kicked out of Mexico. Sometimes we have to go to Vacaville prison. And so there's this shadow side. There's the shadow side of everything that the collective community has been through. And our next speaker, talks about this stuff with great passion. Producer of Boomfest, director of Fractal Nation, Artist Collective, author, filmmaker. You can call him Hortense. His name, Charles Shaw.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all today. I want to make a couple of quick corrections. I'm one of the assistant project managers for Boom, but I'm actually not one of the producers. And my co-director of Fractal Nation is Andrew Jones. He was sitting in here a minute ago, and he just took off. So wanted to give him props on that. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed the respectable part of the presentation. Now we're going to get into mine. I'm going to open with this quote by Kingsley Dennis. It's probably one of the most succinct and powerful statements on the issue. For long periods of human history, there has been active forces penetrating our world that seek to keep humanity asleep and distracted from themselves. Also that these forces are aware of the true power of human consciousness, and that the social power structures used to influence and manipulate the masses would collapse if true human potential were to be exercised. Therefore, in the pursuit of control and power, certain forces active upon the earth aim to artificially suppress the natural evolution of human consciousness. Humanity is caught in a struggle, and our consciousness is the battleground. It may come as unnerving news to some to hear that humanity is constantly being bombarded by forces and events beyond our control. This does not make us impotent, however. All natural organisms are under the influence of external forces. Yet with humanity, there is also other forces at work. These forces are deliberate, more often than not man-made, and manipulate with intent. They aim to persuade if possible and coerce if necessary. Scroll up, please. It is these forces that seek to target the remaining spaces where humanity has a modicum of free choice and free will. To some degree, these forces are part of the requirements of civilization to shepherd and organize a burgeoning population. Yet over and above, there exist exploitative forces that work against the laws of conscious evolution. It is these forces and the need to overcome them that form a core theme of our times. The perpetual battlefield is what we know as our everyday lives, our education, our work, our leisure, our emotional and spiritual well-being, and our conscious thinking. Yet the armaments of this struggle are not guns, tanks, airplanes, bombs, or battle cruisers. It is much more subtle than this. It is less hardware and more software. It is, in effect, a very silent war, and it is a war which, I hope to show, is even more important than the tragic physical scourges occurring on our beautiful planet. It is a war that targets not only the present, but also the very long-term future, or futures, of our civilization, and it has been going on for as long as humankind has existed on planet Earth. What is this war? It is a battle for our minds, how we think. In short, it is the war of consciousness. Now, I'm going to let my friend Graham here. This is my friend Graham Hancock. Some of you may know him. I'm about to embark on a 6-week Australian and New Zealand tour with him and Dennis McKenna and Mitch Schultz. This is probably the single greatest statement on the subject I have ever heard.
What I see in Western civilization has been a gradual trend over hundreds, thousands of years towards increased individual freedom. Towards removing the unreasonable power of the state to intervene in our lives. This seems to have been the direction of Western civilization, except in one area where we've actually gone back rather than forwards in the last 40 years, and that is the area of personal individual use of drugs. It seems to me that if we are not sovereign over our own consciousness, then we can't meaningfully claim to be sovereign over anything. It's useless, a complete waste of time, to indulge ourselves in all sorts of self-congratulation about how free we are, about how our democracies are a model of freedom, when we're prepared to send people to prison for exploring that most intimate, that most precious, that most sapient part of themselves, which is their own consciousness. I feel that
Okay, so the title of my book is Exile Nation, Drugs, Prisons, Politics, and Spirituality. It's sitting over there on the table. I encourage you all to read it if you get a chance. It charts my experience as a drug addict, as a drug war prisoner, as a drug war activist, and ultimately as a seeker of what we like to call cognitive liberty, which is the ability to learn, to grow, to experience life, to medicate, to nourish oneself in the manner of one's own choosing. What we are engaged in is not just a war on consciousness, it is a war for cognitive liberty. And the scope of the problem is large. The reason that I titled my book Exile Nation is because it is my way of trying to quantify and create a metaphor for the millions upon millions of people in this country that have been affected by this war on consciousness and this war on cognitive liberty. And let me just give you a quick rundown on what I'm talking about here. Okay, as we stand here right now, there are currently 2.5 million people sitting in a prison cell across this country. There are an additional 7.5 million people that are being directly monitored by the state every hour of every day on some form of parole, probation, supervision, or other form of court intervention. There are an additional 13 million to 14 million people who are walking around with a felony conviction on their record from the past. There are an additional 65 million people in this country who cannot pass a background check to get gainful employment because of a previous arrest or conviction. 65 million people equates to roughly 1/5 of our population. So when you add all of those people together, and then when you add all of their relatives together, and all of the people that have been directly affected by having someone in the correctional system, what you've got is upwards of 75 to 100 million people that have been directly touched by this. This is not an isolated phenomenon. This is an overwhelming problem. It is largely concentrated in the United States because the United States, despite marketing itself as the so-called land of the free, as the so-called beacon of freedom in the world, the defender of liberty, incarcerates more of its citizens than any other nation in the world, including China, who has a population roughly 5 times the size of the United States. Now just take a minute to let all that sit in. We incarcerate people on a rate of 760 people per 100,000, if you can fathom that, if you're a math person. The next closest is China with about 200, and then Russia, and then Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, repressive states, right? So we, the free country, is right up there at the top on an order of like 4 or 5 larger than the next biggest competitor. Almost kind of like analogous to our defense spending and looking at it with other countries. There are 2.5 million people employed by the criminal justice system, watching those 2.5 million people inside the criminal justice system. It spends an average of $212 billion a year, which is about 1/3 of our annual defense budget. So why is this? Why do I care? Why does any of this matter to me? How do you explain trying to make sense of a drug addiction? How do you explain having your entire life turned upside down because of something that you chose to put inside your own body for reasons that we, as people who understand at least the psychology or the physiology behind addiction understand that we have something that is either somewhere between a genetic illness to a soul sickness. And we punish that by putting people inside prison cells and taking away their ability to have a livelihood and to have decent, respectable living, family, friends, community. Most people that have an arrest or conviction on their record cannot hold any public sector job. They cannot teach, they can't be licensed nurses, they can't work in daycare, they can't work with old people, can't work with young people, can't work with special needs people. They can't work in a school or around there, they can't serve food, they can't work in a hospital, they can't work in any state, municipal, federal office. They can't work in most corporations now because in post 9/11 America, everyone from McDonald's all the way to Chase Manhattan Bank requires extensive background checks to work. So my book and my story takes place largely in 2005 when I was sent away for a year for possessing 11 pills of MDMA. And those 11 pills got me 2 years in the correctional system and changed my life forever. Now, why did I have those 11 pills? I had those 11 pills because, as I mentioned before, I had a crack addiction for 10 years. It began when I was 22 years old and just graduating college and lasted till I was about 31 years old. And in the process of that and the causes that led me into the addiction, which was a childhood that was rife with a lot of violence, sexual abuse, rape, all of the things that you hear about that drive people into addictions. Rather than being able to find a way to heal from that, rather than finding a way to even just deal with the drug addiction, because I didn't have money, I suddenly ended up like a casualty. So I got a couple convictions. I ended up having to try to piecemeal a lifestyle together throughout my 20s and 30s. And eventually 9/11 came around, and it was a very, very, very challenging day for me because, not because of what happened. I mean, I realized years later that what 9/11 really was the shattering of the last understanding or the last thread I had of reality that was holding whatever I had together. Because when this whole thing started to come down, I realized that like everything that I had ever believed in or held on to was kind of coming down too. And I had this epic personal collapse on that day and started a very long crawl out of it. And about 4 years into this, and this is like after 11 years of Alcoholics Anonymous and all of that, which did not work for me. And so I set out by hook or by crook, bare-knuckled and bare-toothed to get through this addiction and to hang on, and I did. I'm one of a very, 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 very small percentage of people that have just done it, right? 95% of all people who enter rehab will use again within 5 years, and half of them go back to active addiction within a year. Those are the active stats on the 12-step abstinence model recovery right now, right? So I came across some people that went to this thing called Burning Man, right? It was this like thing out in the desert, right? And so they told me all about this psychedelic stuff. And like I had tried psychedelics in college, but the rave era that started right when I graduated college and ended right when I quit smoking crack in that 90s period, passed me by because I was too busy dealing with that very serious addiction in some of the poorest neighborhoods and major cities in this country. So I was in a totally different culture. It passed me by, and I didn't get to experience any of this. And my last experience with LSD was when I was 21 years old, and I burnt like 15 pounds of chicken just over a grill trying to cook for people, and got screamed at by my friends, and it turned into a really bad experience, and that was kind of like, okay, maybe I'm done with that childish stuff. And these guys were telling me about this organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I'm like, wow, that's kind of weird. Like, where'd that come from? And they were telling me about this thing called MDMA. I'm like, ecstasy, oh wow, that's the stuff that put holes in your brain, right? I mean, it's pretty programmed to believe whatever the received opinion was on psychedelics. I had a lot of fear to approach them. I took them anyway. And one of the things I started to be taught about was the treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'd been suffering from for about 15 years at that time, 15 to 20 years. Well, the form of it that is the prolonged and chronic form. It's not the kind that's brought about by war trauma, but it's the kind that's brought about by prolonged abuse. And so I started taking this stuff at 35 years old for the first time. And within a 2-week period, I was reintroduced to MDMA, LSD, and DMT all at once. Well, DMT for the first time, all at once. It's a very condensed period to be introduced to like 3 incredibly powerful substances. So the effect that it had on a 35-year-old man who had never done that and came out of a crack addiction was that I basically like donned a white robe and started walking around like Leonard Nimoy in Star Trek 4, just like proselytizing psychedelics to anyone who would listen, trying to get everybody to get high with me right now, right, to feel good. It's an understandable reaction. It happens to a lot of people when they get into that situation, particularly people who get into this renaissance and this revolution of life late in life. But it made me careless. And I'm not going to get into all the details because it's in the book, but basically when I got out of my drug addiction, I dove into activism as a way to channel all of this terrible energy that I had because I wanted to rage against the state because I blamed the state for everything. Obviously, it had to be. My parents and the state screwed me up, so I was going to take them both down. And, I found that the radical activist world was a kind of a magnet for, disaffected, alienated people that had authority problems. That's why the anarchist movements tend to be very drawn to some kind of like confrontational direct action and things like that. And so as I was playing out that whole, saga, that whole psychological saga about who am I really angry at, I became very disillusioned. And I kind of walked away from it. That's when I left Chicago. And I left Chicago because I got into a whole thing with the Chicago police due to my activist work. I was connected with a group that was bringing a suit against the police for wrongful prosecutions of Latinos. And there were scores of Latino youth that were being sent away for 40, 50, 60 years for crimes they didn't commit because they were Latino and they didn't speak English. And they were easy targets for open and unsolved cases. And so one of the mothers of one of these kids who got 47 years decided to fight it. And she found an eyewitness to the actual murder that her son got put away for. She was connected to a coalition I belonged to. They had a press conference. She announced her intention to sue the police, and the police were afraid. Totally unrelated to that, I got pulled over one night. I actually wasn't pulled over, they were in front of me, but a car slammed to its brakes while I was following behind it one night. 4 plainclothes police officers jumped out of the car, surrounded my car, started giving me grief about riding their back end, and told me to get out of the car and that they wanted to, told me they wanted to get out of the car and they wanted to search my car. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have any drugs in the car or anything to compromise me. And so I decided to stand my ground because I had been an activist for all this time and I knew what my rights were. And I told them no. I told them that they didn't have probable cause and they couldn't search my car. They did anyway. They beat the shit out of me. They put a fake case on me. And I ended up having to fight this case. It was pretty bad. And I left Chicago to get away for my own safety. That's when I came to San Francisco and found psychedelics for the first time. Okay. So that's kind of my story and how I got into it. And I ended up in prison because of it. And so about 2/3 of my book covers the actual prison experience, most of it on a day-to-day level. And then the last section of it really goes into my backstory and tells you everything that got me there, right? So in this time, I kind of realized a number of things, and these are tangents that we could go off on for hours, so I'm not going to actually focus on those. But one of them is the role of our governments, all colonial governments, and most Western governments in drug trafficking, and how they have used the drug trade to foster operations around the globe meant to keep them in power and destabilize other governments and other political parties that are threatening to them. In other words, to make the world safe for American business. And when you can't go to your Congress and requisition that money, and you can't go to the people and tax them for it, you have to find another way to do it. So the way the United States and the UK and Israel and Russia all do it is by selling guns and by selling drugs. And so we control Afghanistan and we control Colombia, so we control the 2 primary sources of coca and opium in the world. And ever since we have gone into those places, production has skyrocketed. So if there really is an anti-drug agenda there, it's not being implemented very well. So you have to ask yourself why. Like, why have they spent this much time, energy, and money locking up so many people, destroying so many lives? There's 2 answers to that question, and those 2 answers depend on where you are in the socioeconomic ladder. If you are like us, which I see here as a predominantly Caucasian, affluent group sitting in an Ivy League university. The reason that they're afraid is because if you take some of these substances, you get ideas, right? And these ideas are kind of antithetical to how the establishment wants you to be trained and what they want you to do when you go out into this world. They don't want you to rock the boat. They don't want revolutions of anything. They want you to be good citizens. They want you to go out and run those law firms and run those banks and run those corporations and make money for this system. And once you start to buck that, that's when you become a threat. That's what the terror that came into our society 40-some years ago, 45 years ago, when the Harvard Psychedelic Club and other people started experimenting and tearing apart the social fabric of this country simply by saying, this way of living is not right, and we are liberating our consciousness now. And that liberation struck terror into the heart of the power structure in this country and most of the people living in this country. They were a very small minority, but they had a tremendous influence. And so the repression on that was very, very severe. And it lasted almost 40 years. Where there was an absolute moratorium on even beneficial medicinal research was completely shut down. In that time, the law enforcement culture was inculcated into this belief that if they came anywhere in contact with these substances, that they would go insane. Sasha Shulgin tells an amazing story of how when the police raided his place back in 2003, and they were demanding that he turn over all the drugs that he had, and he had already been raided in 1994. The DEA had already taken his Schedule I license. He didn't have anything remotely illegal on his property except a couple of San Pedro cactus that were growing in the ground, and I'm not sure they're illegal when they're growing in the ground. I could be wrong on this. But they pointed out, yeah, well, there's that San Pedro cactus you're standing next to, at which point 3 police officers jumped about 15 feet in the air and ran away from it, ran away from a cactus. Okay, are we all getting this? So when they said, well, it's not going to bite you, what are you afraid of? They explained that if they come into contact with a psychedelic substance, that they lose their ability to be a field officer, they lose their ability to carry a gun, and they're attached to a desk for the rest of their life for one encounter with a psychedelic substance. And that's a culture. It's not based on any science, it's not based on anything real, it's just a cultural thing in order to prejudice law enforcement against anybody who uses this, right? So the other side of that is a little bit simpler to understand, really, but it's not something that I really don't think anyone in this room has had much understanding or direct contact with. And what that is you can call it Marxist analysis of this concept of surplus labor and surplus population. And it's really quite simple. If you have an economy and you have a population, and you can no longer employ all of the people in this population, but you still have this large population and it continues to grow, then the Bernays Freudian paradigm that came out of the turn of the century when they realized that if they gave people the ability to make a living and to acquire things, that it had the effect of constraining their behavior, giving them purpose, and it tended to make revolution kind of fall away. Like the Russian Revolution scared the piss out of this power structure in the world. Like they saw a populist revolt on the scale that could happen anywhere in the world, and they had to come up with a way to try to devise this, and part of it was poverty. And part of it was a meaningless existence that they felt was this industrial drudgery. So Bernays and Freud, Freud is obviously the mind behind it. Bernays was his nephew who turned it into public relations. And he said, listen, if we just satiate people's needs, we give them what they want, let them indulge themselves, they'll be fine, they'll be docile, they'll be easier to control. And we had that. I mean, if you look at what World War II was, it was basically like they did a trade-off. They said, okay, you go and fight and kill all these people, and when you come back, we'll give you a house, we'll give you a college education, we'll give you a car, we'll give you the ability to invest, we'll give you a pension, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. And we created these socialistic government structures in order to pay off the people that went and fought the war. Well, it was unsustainable. They couldn't continue to pay for it. And so what ended up over time is, as the United States lost its preeminent status as the economic power because of the rise of Japan and the rise of Western Europe, all of these people that had really good jobs in the United States suddenly started to lose them. And this thing called deindustrialization started. This thing called what we call now offshoring, and all of that started. So all of the population that used to work here and create things suddenly started being moved to other countries. And what that left was a largely poor underclass that had no means of employment or advancing themselves. And by the 1980s and 1990s, this was called a management crisis. In other words, you had a permanent underclass that was not able to get out of it, yet they were not leaving the country. So what can you do with them? Well, prior to this period, prison was based in the notion of rehabilitation. After this period, prison and incarceration became about warehousing. It became about keeping people managed in this irascible and intractable underclass that had no advancement opportunities. And so one of the vehicles for that was the war on drugs. And the reason that they used the war on drugs is because they realized two things. This is the first. One of the best books I've read in about the last 10 years is called Intoxication, The Universal Drive for Mind-Altering Substances, by Ronald Siegel, who is a professor at University of California, Los Angeles School of Medicine. And as he says here, history shows that we have always used drugs. In every age and every part of this planet, people have pursued intoxication with plant drugs, alcohol, and other mind-altering substances. Almost every species of animal is engaged in the natural pursuit of intoxicants. This behavior has so much force and persistence that it functions like a drive, just like our drives of hunger, thirst, and sex. This fourth drive is a natural part of biology, creating the irrepressible demand for drugs. In a sense, the war on drugs is a war against ourselves, a denial of our very nature. So this guy named Nixon, I know some of you may remember him, he realized that he was facing what was essentially a political war of ideology with the SDS, the student movement, the Black Panthers, and such, who had a valid political argument and grievance to bring to him. And he realized that he couldn't fight them on the face of their political beliefs because we're America. Freedom of speech, freedom of belief. How can you tell somebody that they can't be socialist or communist or this or that when this is supposed to be a free country? But he realized that this revolution, this young revolution, this student revolution, this black revolution, it had another component to it, which was that they were avowed users of drugs. And he realized, and his tape transcriptions confirm this years later, that if you criminalized their behavior, so in other words, if you criminalized their use of drugs, then you could use that as a pretext to undermine the movement. And that's exactly what they did. He launched the first war on drugs in 1970. And his targets were the anti-war movement and the black nationalist movement. This was picked up by Reagan in the 80s, and then it continued on, and it's been policy ever since. So if you can criminalize somebody's behavior, and you can demonize them on television as a criminal, then you have the door open for a larger police force and police repression, more money going into what I like to call the martial culture, the police state culture, the ability of having the law enforcement and government in every aspect of your business. I don't know how many of you have lived in really poor neighborhoods in the major cities of this country, but if you go into those places, you do not walk down the street with the same kind of rights that a white person does walking down here outside of University of Pennsylvania. You can be stopped at any time for any reason, and they don't have to tell you. You can be locked up for any time, for any reason. And this happens every day to poor people all across this country. So ultimately, what we are facing here is a control issue. And we have the natural evolution of our species that is intersecting with an ossified governmental and economic system that is falling apart all around us. And their way of keeping that system in place is by keeping us in the dark. And this is something that goes all the way back to the Dark Ages when we didn't want to let people read, because if they read, they became enlightened. Well, now the enlightenment path is all in here. And part of what's happening with the plant medicine revolution, in my personal opinion, is that all of that control is starting to shatter, starting to fall apart, because you can't hold that back forever. Thank you so much for listening, and I really appreciate it.